Been a while. Been over to see Harold?
I call him on the phone occasionally. Yeah, I haven't been seeing him probably in 3 or 4 months. But how about you?
I haven't been over since all this stuff.
Yeah, he's had. Yeah, I didn't certainly want to go over during this time. But,
Yeah.
that's why I called him.
No, man, that's good. He's all your.
I got a new phone, and all of a sudden it's got a mind of its own in terms of what it's doing, and so anyway, sorry about that. So this is our third program this year, and this is our second annual year that we focused on Native Americans here in northern Indiana, both historic and prehistoric. I got educated on that last night. I think of everything being more current, but last night we were educated on things that are back to 10,000 years prehistory. So I thought that was interesting. But today we're fortunate to have Trevor Tipton and his wife with us today. Trevor started his artifact collection in 1979. And he did that so he could share it with your fourth grade students. And so his focus over the years has been to preserve the history of noble counties, pre-Columbia era. He's got 41 years teaching experience. When he and I discussed which of the 3 programs, we're doing 3 programs this year, and I said, which of the 3 do you want to do? And I was kind of describing them, and I mentioned one of them was to focus on children, and boom, he jumped right on that one. So thank you for that, Trevor, and with that, I'll turn it over to Trevor Tipton.
Thank you. Well, thank you for having me. I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to people about my collection. But probably I'm going to go a little bit more into detail than what Mark just gave. When I graduated from college, I went to Taylor University down in Upland, Indiana, and I got a job at Central Noble, which was a home to me, really. I grew up in Kindleville and was able to land a job at Central Noble. My first position was a 4th grade classroom. And one of the classes that I had to teach in 4th grade was called Indiana History. Does anybody remember Indiana History when you were in school? Well, they don't have that anymore. It breaks my heart, but yeah. So I go into the classroom and before school started, and I'm looking through the books, and I realized Indiana history. I didn't really ever remember taking Indiana history when I was in school, and I certainly didn't have anything about Indiana history in my undergrad. And so I'm thinking, okay, how am I going to begin teaching a class I really don't know a whole lot about? And so I take the textbook out and I start rifling through it, and little did I realize that book, that Noble County history book, really changed my life in many ways. Because as I started to read about it, I read about things that really intrigued me and interested me. Of course, the very core of Indiana history are the Indians of Indiana. And I started learning about the tribes and the different cultures that live in Indiana. And so I just really got interested in it, and almost overnight it became a passion of mine. And how I got started in all of this was, as a teacher often does, they want to go out and get displays or get things that kids can handle and look at. And I thought, wouldn't it be neat to find an artifact to bring in and let kids handle it? And I remember having a friend who had a brother that collected arrowheads as a kid, and I didn't really think much of it at the time, but I remember that he had this collection, and so I called upon him and asked him if he would come in and talk to my kids about what he had. So he brought in several arrowheads of frames that he had found over the years, and the kids were just sort of mesmerized. They wanted to hang on to it, just like I saw the kids over here wanting to have a picture taken with this. And I thought, this is going to work. And so I followed up with that by asking him if he could at least show me how to go out and look for arrowheads. And so he did. He took me out, and that first time we went out, we found like 4 or 5, and I just could not believe in my mind that you could go out and find artifacts that were so long ago. And that's really what started my collection. And for years and years and years, I spent a lot of time, my wife will attest, a lot of time out in the fields. Of course, this was 1979 to 2000, whatever, and back then, the farmers always fall plowed. after they harvested their corn or whatever crop they had out, they would get in as soon as the harvest was over, and they would turn that soil over. Well, as soon as the snow melted in the springtime, February, March, I'd get out in the fields. And all that stuff had washed up to the top. And those were the glory days of hunting arrowheads in my lifetime. And unfortunately, over the years, Jeff probably remembers, the farming practices changed. And they don't do that anymore. They don't fall plow, they don't mold board, they don't go out and really, in some cases, even break the ground up because they no-till, or in worst cases, they just set aside fields that were once really good fields to look for arrowheads in. So it was sort of unfortunate, you know, that happened, because I have grandchildren now that are dying to go out and look for this stuff, and they see it in my house, and you know, I can take them out, but one of them might spend hours out in the field and just find a couple flakes of that, because all they're doing now is just sort of scratching the surface with their discs, and they just don't really bring up the points like they used to. So anyway, that's a bit of a background on how I got started. And I know I could probably continue on talking about the age of these things and so forth, but I understand Mr. Bickle did some of that last night, and I didn't want to maybe repeat that again, but I'll go maybe in a different direction. But the one thing I will say is this: when I started to teach, I realized that there was a huge variety in span of artifacts and cultures that existed. And so I'll use this date to help you maybe understand. 1492. Ring a bell? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1492 is really that magical date of when history began in the Americas, North America, South America. When Columbus landed here, one of his many journeys he came over here, I think he made 4 in all, but in 1492 was when history began. Things began to be written down. Columbus himself kept thorough journals and diaries of his voyages and things that he found here. And so the news got back to Europe, and then the floodgates opened. They started coming over here by the boatloads, you know, wanting to claim land and wanting to experience what was here. Side note, you know, Columbus didn't really discover America. He was actually believing in his mind that he was in the East Indies. That was his purpose for his trip in the first place. He was trying to find a faster route to India. And so when he landed, where he landed, he thought he was actually in the East Indies. Well, he never did in his lifetime realize that he had actually discovered a whole new continent. And that opened up the floodgates, as I said, for others to follow suit. And so 1492 is the beginning of history. Now, we have a lot of documentation since then. We know of the tribes, the historical tribes we call them, the Miamis and the Pottawatomies and the Wea and the Chippewa, and some of these that you've heard of before. We know a lot about them. We know who their chiefs were. Chief Little Turtle from the Miami tribe, and Chief Pottawatomie, and these people we know a lot about. We know what battles they fought in. We know about the pandemics that they went through. The millions and the hundreds of thousands that died from the diseases. We know about all of that. But before 1492 is what we refer to as the prehistory, the prehistoric time that Mark was talking about. Now, I had no idea how far back that could go. When you're talking about prehistory, was it another 500 years? Was it another 1,000 years? I had no idea. Until I start reading and doing more research and talking to archaeologists and reading about their findings and realizing now that I've got stones and artifacts up here that go back thousands of years. And so it was a whole new world for me to start to study, to start to learn about the age of a lot of these pieces. And again, part of the studying of that not only tells you how old some of these pieces are and what cultures they come from, and then how they were made and what kind of flint they chose, like Jeff back there is doing, and how they lived always just intrigued me. And of course, we don't know much about that because it was prehistory. Were there battles fought back then? Absolutely. Were there civilizations back then? Absolutely. But all that we know is through the efforts of archaeologists. And there was nothing left behind written down. They had no written language, as you all know. And so we were just more or less, at best, guesswork on how they lived. And one of the things that I always was fascinated with is that there were different civilizations over these thousands of years that would come and go. And these civilizations, in many cases, just disappeared. And when they would just disappear, that gets you thinking why and how. And again, it's sort of guesswork. It might have been a pandemic. It might have been disease that wiped them out. It might have been enemy tribes. It might have been droughts. We don't really know what happened to some of these civilizations. But we do know that there were changes. Every time there was a change in civilization, there was an advancement usually, or a change in the way in which they hunted, the way in which they lived and survived, the way in which they worshiped. So if you think about the age, and maybe Jim talked about this last night, but when you go back to the earliest known man, we refer to that person as a paleo man, Paleolithic period. And so the points from that time period are paleo points. And the ones that I have here from Noble County are all in one frame. And these are the oldest of all of the points up here. And it's based upon their shape, the way they were designed, the way they were made. And so for thousands of years, that's what this man that existed back then, the paleo man, used to survive. Now, did they have bow and arrows back then? You think they used these as arrow points? No. They did not use arrows. The earliest man, the paleo man, used spears. And even to the point of where they got advancement in their technology, that their spears, they could design in such a way that it's one thing to throw a spear. And if you think about it, I've got one here. It's one thing to just take it in your hand and to throw it at a mastodon or a buffalo or a deer. But they became very advanced in their technology with what they had to use. And they just came up with a very clever invention, what's called an atlatl. I mean, you know what that is. I know some of you do. The atlatl is a spear throwing device. And so they created a spear. They could, much like a harpoon, they could pull this out, put a new head in, easy enough. And it's got a hook on one end, and they would clasp that down in the hole that's in that end, and they would hold it like this. And now they would throw that. As they would throw it, they would whip that out, and it increased the velocity of this spear. That was an amazing invention, and changed the way things were done in terms of hunting. Now, prehistoric. Thousands of years ago. Do you think anything that we have today will be around 1,000 years from now? No. The houses that we live in? No. Nothing that we probably use in our day-to-day life will be around. But the Indians, the Native Americans, because they use stone, stone still exists. And it's just hard to imagine something, when you pick it up, is literally thousands of years old, but stone never decays. And that's why these things still exist, is because they never decayed. Now the handles in which were attached to them, yes, they're gone. I have to reproduce these handles to show kids what the celts or the head inside of it looked like. And so I make the handle very, very similar to the way it was done back then. and to show the kids that this was their form of what we call a celt inside of a tomahawk. Maybe you've heard that term before, but it was a killing machine that would just come crashing down on your enemy's skull and get the job done. That was a weapon. Different sizes, different shapes. As you can see here, just a little bit different handle, but the same technology in putting this head into this handle. When I first started finding celts, I always wondered how they attach this to a stick, to a handle. Yeah, in my mind, I thought, okay, they must take a lot of leather and wrap and bind it around there. And I thought, this just doesn't look so right. It didn't feel so right. And then I started reading about it. And I found out that, they were very, very intelligent people. And all they did was their celt, the rock that they made, is tapered just a little bit. And I would always look at that and think, well, what was the purpose of that being tapered? The taper was the ingenious design that they would make a hole in their handle. And the taper means that it would go in easy enough, but as it got wider and wider, it began to jam. And so all that is in there held by is pressure. You take it and put it in there and you hammer down on a piece of wood and it sets it. It's called a socket set. Boom. Now it sets it in there, and you know what? It's in there. It's not coming out. Unless, if I turn it over, hit it on a piece of wood, pops right out. Ingenious design they came up with. And so I try to take myself that I find, and I like to put them into a handle just to give the kids an idea of what it looked like, how it was used, how it was made. And again, the ingenious invention of just setting that in there in such a way, letting the pressure of the taper of the stone set it.
So does it look like you burned that hole?
Yeah, I fire hardened it a little bit. Wood sometimes becomes harder if it's fire hardened, so you're around the edges of it, just put a little bit of a heat source to it. Looks better too. Okay, so anyway, back to the prehistory. Everything I have up here is prehistoric, with the exception of a couple pieces over here. I've got a couple of historical pieces, the beadwork that we can talk about later if you're interested in that. But everything else you're going to see up here is prehistoric. And those that collect prehistoric artifacts, they understand how old they are. And they understand in my mind, they're priceless because it's history. And that was sort of the direction that I took with my collection, was that it's one thing to have it, but it's another thing to share it. So I was bringing it in and showing it to my students and my kids, and they liked it. And I thought, I really, really would like to get a big collection and do this kind of stuff. And that's what I do now. I like to take my collection out, talk about it, and show to students, adults alike, so that they can learn about the history. Now, I didn't find every piece up here. And that was asked by several people. I started off finding a lot, and I think Jeff probably started off the same way. When you're young, you're energetic, and you want to get out and walk the fields all day long, you find a lot. The most I ever found was 36 in one day. Of course, I've had a lot of zeros out there too. Spend all day and find nothing, but location, that's what it's all about. The Native Americans lived close to water. And I understand there was quite a settlement over here on the, what we call the North Bank or something like that, the Indian Hill or something, that there was quite a collection taken from. Lake Wawasee, Lake Papakichi, all these lakes had civilizations around them. Noble County is blessed to have 92 lakes, and there's Indian villages around all of them. Now, unfortunately, there's a lot of houses around them too, so all of those artifacts are buried there somewhere. But what I like to do is to get out into the fields that are maybe on the offset of some of these lakes, where the tributary, the streams feed into them, and that's where I also find campsites as well. And so the lakes around the Channel Lake Park, I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but I've hunted around, all of those tributaries that feed into there. Those were hot spots for the Indians because they needed a source of water. It also was a source of transportation. And it was a source of hunting. Game needs water too. And so they were close to the, where game lived as well. The deer, anything else, they ate and used their furs for. I like bringing the furs in to show to the kids, and they love that. It's furs that I trap, but also I like it because of the importance in the history of the skin played in the historical parts of things. We get to that. So their lifestyle was truly unique, and the stones and the weapons and the tools that they used were truly unique. And like I said, it's almost priceless when you think about it because of the age of a lot of this. There's nothing else I can think of. Mark,
How do you determine the age?
the age, again, through archaeology. Where's my archaeologist in here? There are a couple of them I know. The gentleman. There he is. Okay. The age is determined through archaeology. When archaeologists get on a site and they, do their studies and they do their, do what they do, they usually over the years have labeled that piece based upon the name of the farmer that owns the property. I'm not sure where all the names came from, but for instance, a thieves' point or a McCorkle or whatever name that was given to it usually reflects back to the farm that maybe the archaeology took place from. And then they would do their carbon 14 or however else they come up with the dates of that, and then that name sticks. In fact, I see Jeff's got a poster back there, I think, that shows some of that. Is that right, Jeff? The ages and so forth. And so archaeologists have been the people who have deemed how old they are and what, the age and the tribe that maybe went along with that. Adena. I'll talk about Adena because I've got frame here some Adena. I thought I did. There we go. The Adena points right here, I also call beaver tails. They've got that rounded tail on it, such as that. And there's three of them right here in the middle. And the Adena point was prevalent to this area because the Adena culture and the Hobo culture thrived in this area in Ohio. That's where they lived. That's where they built their villages and they just hunted in the fields. And so the Adena culture, again, came later after the Paleo, and they would be considered maybe the late Archaic period. And they lived around here, around these lakes and fields from about 500 before Christ, BC, and 500 AD. It's about a 1,000-year period that they thrived here. But they also were known as the Mound Builders. And this is where I'm fascinated with. I'm fascinated with because all the old history books that I've read, Noble County history, and the earliest one that I've read was 1882, they talked about the mounds. You know what mounds are? Anybody? Okay. They were the burial mounds most of the time for their maybe people who were important to them, their chief possibly. In some cases, they were just built to give them a high place to build a temple on top of, to worship from. But in these burial mounds, they found very intriguing things. Artifacts, skeletons, charcoal. That is what the early archaeologists uncovered. And this took place in Noble County in the late 1800s. There was a time period of about 10 years there that all these fields in Noble County that had been cleared and plowed up now displayed these mounds. And so they would go into these and they would dig them up and they would get to these relics and get to the skeletons. And then, unfortunately, we don't know much about it. They talk a little bit about it in the history books, but the pieces that were found, the thoroughness of the, the details that should have been done, am I right? All that has to be I's dotted and T's crossed to make sure everything is explained and whatever was found is cataloged. And that didn't happen in 1880, unfortunately. We've lost so much of that valuable information. People want to call them grave robbers. Well, they didn't know better back then. They were just interested in it. There was a Dr. Eagles that had his practice in Albion, Indiana. And Dr. Eagles, according to these Noble County history books, had a vast collection of skeletons, of artifacts that came from several of these mounds. He would go to the property owner and ask if they could go out and unearth it, which, was no big deal back then. The farmers didn't really care. And so they would dig and spend time unearthing all this. And of course, he had a tremendous display in his dentist office. And people would come and look at it, obviously. The unfortunate thing is, I have never been able to find out what happened to his collection. And by reading this, I thought, I wonder if there are any collections out there that still exist. Bingo. That is where my collection really began to grow. Being a school teacher, you know a lot of people. Being a football coach, you meet a lot of people, know a lot of people. And I started getting some connections, and people knew that I started doing this, and people would have me come and speak at churches, at schools, and I've spoken in a lot of different places. But my name started getting out and about. And the first time this happened was my colleague of mine who lived right across, or who taught right across the hallway from me. She said, Mr. Tipton said, I've got some artifacts you might be interested in. You want to come and look at them? Bingo, I did. I went right there immediately, and I wanted to see what she had. Whoa, did she have a collection? They were just stuck in an old shoebox, big shoebox. And when I opened that up, my eyes just sort of popped out, and I saw a collection of artifacts. And as I found out the history of it, it went back to the mid-1800s. It had been in the family for over 100 years. And you don't find those collections very often, or get the opportunity to buy them. And so we worked out a deal. She wanted me to have it because she knew what I was doing. I was going to preserve it. It didn't mean anything for her. It had been in the shoebox in the closet for all these years. And so it did her heart good to know that that collection is on display. And I think I talked about some of these in the posters that I have up here. But as I started to dig further, the farm that they were collected on is actually talked about in the 1882 history of Noble County. On that farm, there was what they thought at the time a huge battle based upon the number of skeletons that were just laying out in the field open, and the artifacts that existed laying out there. And so when they came and they saw this, they collected it, they started putting it away in shoe boxes. And so I've got to think that some of that collection came from was it a battle? My guess is yes, if the skeletons were just laying out on the surface. And so that is one way that I was able to collect valuable pieces, historically speaking, where someone just wanted me to have it to do this. And that got the ball rolling. The most recent one, Albert J. Hart, Sparta Township. Some of you know where that's at, not too far from here, not too far from Indian Village. The wife of my principal came to me and said, I've got a collection you might be interested in. And I went and I looked at it, and wow, same thing. It was filled with beautiful pieces. Long story short, it took me about 20 years to actually get it because she wasn't really ready to let it go. It had been in the family. Her great-great-great-grandfather collected it back in the 1860s.
Do you know what his name was?
Right here.
Oh, that was his
Yep,
his
that
great
too.
great
Yep,
great.
yep. And so everything on their picture came from that collection. There were 210 really nice arrowheads. This is the best of the best, including the slate pendant. Now, what makes this slate pendant so unique, and I know some of you probably are familiar with pendants, but this slate pendant is about 1/8 of an inch thick. This slate pendant also has 93 tally marks all the way around it. Now, tally marks, we have no idea what they really stand for, but a tally mark is just a tally mark. It's a way in which they inscribe into the edge of the stone, keeping track of something. Now, I've got others up here that have tally marks in them, 5, 6, 7, but 93 of them, wow. I just, I get excited every time I talk about it. But these were other coins that came from that collection. There were 5 slate pendants in that collection, and all of them were taken off the Hart farm. There's a cemetery and a church on that road that goes down. Now, Lake is there, right away. There's a cemetery there, Broadway. It was in that vicinity. Well, I've been fortunate, very fortunate, to come up with several of those collections to enhance my collection. Again, it's not really something that I'm hiding away and putting it in, a safe deposit box, because that's not where it belongs. It belongs out, just like the museum that you have out here. It needs to be seen. Kids need to see it. Adults need to see it. You need to learn from it. That's the beauty thing about history. Now, speaking of the mound builders, I got time for a couple more stories, I hope. The intriguing thing that I find about the mound builders, Jeff, you tell me if you've heard any of this. In some of these mounds, there were giants. Heard of them, Jeff?
Oh, yeah.
Giants meaning 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 foot tall. Heard of them? I've been intrigued with that ever since I first read it. And I've studied it, and I found out that, it was not uncommon for them to be found in Tennessee, not uncommon to be found in Kentucky. West Virginia had some. Noble County had some. LaGrange County had some. And they took these skeletons, and this Dr. Eagles I was telling you about, he had a skull that they described as being just huge. Neanderthal, huge. And I've always been intrigued with that story. I think what I've heard, the Smithsonian has some of these somewhere in their museum. But was there really a giant race of people that were here? Well, proof's in the skeletons. And it's intriguing. What happened to them? We'll never know. What happened to a lot of these Adenas and Hopewells? We'll probably never know. There was no written language. Jeff, what have you heard about it? You read anything about it, and you come across any part in your studies?
I thought of Marion County that they found a giant down there.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, we have the Bible culture up there.
Right.
It's hard to tell exactly where that culture or race came from, but it is.
Yeah. You heard of it too? That's all you're hearing about it? Pardon? Okay. Right. All right. Yeah, unfortunately. Well, that's one of the things that always intrigued me, was these giants that existed. And I'd love to have one of those on display in your museum or someplace. Another story I'd like to share with you, it was during one of these talks, I was speaking to a ladies group at the Presbyterian Church there in Albion. And I was sitting there, I was going through my artifacts and talking about the civilizations, and when it was all said and done, this little old lady, she was 90 years old. She came walking up, she was pretty frail and feeble, and she has this little purse. And she opens it up, said, Mr. Tipton, I'd like for you to look at this. And she opens up, and this thing wrapped in a doily, and she unwraps it. And it's a piece of slate, you know, about that big. And on that slate is scribed the following. I've been taken prisoner, brought here by the big waters. I've been treated very hard. Another man is here. His name is Alan, the same as mine. And it's signed J. Allen. I said, man, where did you get this? I said, well, her grandmother found it on the Randall farm. Now, the Randall farm was just north of Indian Village. And when she was out hoeing her garden, up comes this stone. And she had it all these years, been passed down to the family all these years. And I looked at it, and I'm telling you, it's authentic. There was nothing, you know, phony about it. The person that had inscribed it on a piece of slate probably had something very hard, and I don't know how he got it in there, but it was inscribed into it. The year, by the way, I forgot to tell you this, 1760. 1760. And that's far earlier than what we have recorded history of in Noble County. The first man in Noble County was Joel Bristow, and he came in 1827. So, you know, 60, 70 years prior to that, this man was captured out east, brought here by the way of the big waters. Any idea what that might be? Great Lakes, Great Lakes. That was a very common way for them to come. And then by the time they got to Lake Erie, they would come down the Maumee to Fort Wayne, which is where Tekianga existed. That was the capital of the Miami world. And so that, in my opinion, is how they got here. And then treated very hard. You know, some of the people that survived these ways of life, that they were treated brutally, treated as slaves in many cases. But he had the presence of mind to sit down there underneath the tree someday, and one day, and write his story. And little did he know that it was going to be unearthed hundreds of years later, and now it sits in the Noble County Old Jail Museum. I really, really, really wanted that piece. I offered her a lot of money for it. But, you know, and she was hesitant, I understand, but we got the next best thing. She donated it to the museum, and which is where it would have ended up anyway. But, you know, it's where it needs to be, Noble County Museum, that's where it came.
It was written in English.
It was written in English.
And his
Yes.
name was Al.
Allen, last name of Allen. And I had looked, man, have I looked. There are records of people that have been kidnapped, and I've looked through all those records. I cannot find them. Go ahead with your question. I'm sorry.
Well, I was going to say, so you don't really know if he was Native American or if he was.
No, no, it's just hypothetical, I guess. I'm thinking that, you know, he was, in my opinion, a white person who was taking care of it.
And he just
He was
happened,
educated, absolutely. He was
and
educated.
anybody happened to find this piece, possibly find
The piece
it?
of slate.
Yeah.
Yeah, slate is native to Noble County. It was not uncommon to go out and find a piece of slate. And I really, really wanted to bring that today, and I didn't, but I have used it on displays before. But if you do want to see it, you can go to the Noble County Old Jail Museum. It's on display there. And it's authentic. And this wasn't uncommon. You know, looking back through some of these early Noble County history books, you'll see other pieces that were found because this was not uncommon. And that's going to be my next story I'm going to tell, is that in the historical time periods from 1700 to the early 1800s, this 100-year period, was a brutal time period. It was a time period where there was death daily because of the attacks that were going on. The Indians were fed up with their land being taken from them. And so they would viciously attack the settlers coming into Indiana and kill them, slaughter them. But what they many, many, many times did was kidnap young children. And by kidnapping young children, they could quickly repopulate their declining population. They could, in a matter of a year or two, get them so changed and brainwashed into becoming one of them, and then that helped quickly repopulate. And so the stories that we have read about, and stories that exist, because it's historical time period, are fascinating readings and very interesting. In fact, I've got a couple of books here. Probably the most famous is the Kanakwa, also known as Frances Slocum. You ever heard of the Frances Slocum story? Not too far from here. She was kidnapped when she was 5 in Pennsylvania, brought here, and ended up being found 60 years later by a brother. And she was able to tell her story. What a fascinating story that is. And the only way that the brother recognized her is because she had a couple fingers that had been chopped off when she was an infant. And that was the only way that he could recognize her. And once she realized and understood that this was her brother, then what a reunion that was. If you've not read the book, you need to. It's good. William Wells, this particular one also talks about William Wells. William Wells was a young man, had flaming red hair. And because the Indians looked at this red hair as being special, like they spared his life, they adopted him. Little Turtle himself adopted him into his family. And William Wells goes on to be a Miami Indian, fought against the white people in the battles that took place in the 1700s. And one day he went to Little Turtle and said, I'm having second thoughts here, Dad. I feel it's wrong for me to kill these white people because they're my blood. And so he left, went back to the American Army, and became a very important figure historically because he did a lot of the interpretation of peace treaties. And just, again, a very good read if you're interested in historical things. The one that I have always been fascinated with is the story of a 3-year-old boy. The family is called the Noe family, N-O-E. Aaron Noe lived in 1840s, which is, Noble County was in the primitive days, just outside of Cromwell. And one day, Mr. Noe was taking his load of grain to have it milled. And the 3-year-old boy followed him, walking behind the wagon. And when the father realized that he was following him, he stopped and got down and told him he needs to go back home. This was not a journey for him. And so he sent him home. Well, the 3-year-old boy, was never seen or heard from again. Instantly that night, when he realized Mom thought that, he was with Dad, and Dad thought he went back home to Mom, and it was that panic that took place. And all the settlers in Sparta Township and from around went on a massive search for this boy. I even have a copy. There was a reward posted that was in the Fort Wayne Sentinel in 1841. Any information regarding this little boy, please, there's a reward given for any information. So it was June 3rd, 1841 when he was taken. And he was never, ever found. They had no idea what happened to him. They looked to the swamps, they looked through the wood, the forest. You know, it wasn't that big of a place that he could have really gotten lost. The only explanation they came up with is that he was kidnapped by the Indian tribes. There were some still local Indians in the area back in 1840. Some small bands still existed. And that was their theory that maybe he just was kidnapped. You never know. But again, one of those stories that it's interesting reading. Very interesting just to let your mind imagine and wander a little bit. So. Yes?
I have two related questions. I'm wondering, the native people didn't have written history, but they had a very substantial body of
Oral history,
I
absolutely.
wonder if in your context of your work, you're wondering if you had occasion to really spend time interfacing with some of the descendants of First Nation peoples and to hear the way they remember their story. And then the second question, if from that you can share wisdom, you know, that is useful to us who haven't had that.
That's what I'm going to do when I retire. No, I've not ever spoken to the natives. There still are people within Indiana. I've had students in my classroom, believe it or not, who actually receive annuities from the government because they were like 1/8 Miami. So there's still that Miami connection in our community, Pottawatomie as well. So I have had students. In fact, one of them was able to go to college for free because he was a certain, you know, so far removed, I think the third generation removed from being Miami Indian, Tanner Guthrie. So to get their oral history, I think I would have to go probably to the reservations where they are still maybe, you know, what's the right word, full-blooded. I don't know if that history gets passed down once it, you know, is not full-blooded anymore. Now they're just 1/8 Miami. So the answer, no. I have read a lot of accounts though, and being a believer, this is why it's important to me. All of the Indian tribes that I've read, the history that they were able to write down. Now this would have been the historical tribes, the Miamis, the Pottawatomie. When others came along to get this history written down, they all would reflect back to when their tribe began. That was a part of their oral history. Our tribe originated from. They all could go back to the Great Flood. Interesting. The beginning of their civilization would always have some sort of, you know, mythical creature that came from the flood waters and, you know, planted a corn stalk on but anyway, they're all a little bit different, but it's interesting that they had an account of the Great Flood in their history. I always found that fascinating. So yeah, when I retire, I'd like to do more of that. In fact, when I retire, I'd like to do a lot more of that. So, any other questions? I do want you to have time to come up and look at any of the artifacts that you would like to. If you want to pick them up and hold them, I know I asked to let the little ones here do just that. Fine. So if you have any questions, I'll still hang around. Mark, we good?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, clearly we didn't have enough time. I mean, I think Trevor could go on and on with great stories and captivate us with his knowledge of all these artifacts. So thank you so much, Trevor. So as he said, he's going to be here to answer any questions, so come up and ask him. And I'd also ask you to go back and see Jeff in the corner. He's actually making current day artifacts, flintknapping. So stop and see Jeff on your way out. Also in your handout that we gave you, there's mostly blue half page, sometimes it's white, sometimes it's a different color, that helps us know where did you come from today to come to this meeting, and how did you find out about this gathering that we had today. So help us know that so we know where to communicate and where to provide marketing material for other events, if you would. Either leave that on your chair or on the table in the back, and we'd appreciate that. Okay, with that, you're free to go, or go back and see Jeff, or come up and see Trevor.
Stay tuned while I take you on a slight tour.
Now, these here are spear points. So you know that these are not as old as these, because these spear points, again, come from a different culture, like the Adena. This is a Thebes point, which goes back even further yet. And the reason you know that is because the archaeologists that do their digs and do their investigation, they can carbon date these based upon what's in the mound or whatever that they're doing their archaeology with, and that's how they date them. All pieces that look like this are called Thebes, and it's it's about 5,000 years old. It's just incredible. These are time of Christ, 2,000 years old.
I tried to tan a deer hide in the 70s.
Didn't work. Excuse me, let me get in here real quick and tell our online guests what's going on here. Excuse me, I'll get
They've been doing this in our garage.
Have they?
And I go out walking on all these little pieces. Oh, I bet. You get yourself a tarp, put down.
Yeah.
That's what we need.
A few copper nails. See those little flakes that make tools. You can use them as engravers. You can grind them down and make, put a point on it. Now, traditionally, they would have used tools like those right there, which are made out of bone, antler, and hammer stones made out of different types of rocks. Soft hammer stones and hard hammer stones. See, it's just a process, just keep shaping it to get to that point.
And then go turn it,
See, that right there could be a projectile point in a minute. But, just keep working on it and put notches in it. And you get it down to this stage here. And then what I do is I use a pressure flaker, copper nail. They would have used the tip of an antler here or a piece of bone. And then I've made my own little hand pad here so I don't stab myself. They would use maybe a piece of leather or some type of plant material. And then I keep working the edges, bringing the center line of the stone up. So as you can see, it's starting to get a little convex around it, and then it's starting to get the sharp edges. See the edge? and then I'll keep working this into a point. How they would have done the notches is they would have probably come in, depending on the point type or time period like he was talking about, you could start in at the corner. This is just copper nail you can get at Ace Hardware. And then you could put it into a handle of some sort. And I use it backhand, but some people nap like this forward. I use it like this because I build up more pressure to take flints off. And then I keep turning it over and over to get the notch. See, so there would be a notch right there. Then I would do the other side, and then put the tip on the point. So. Yeah, the addle. Oh, those are cool. I have one, and we threw it around the 4th of July. We had a blast with it. Got a big foam target that we throw at. And then I put a deer in front of it. It's got a lot of broken points in it.
Well, I don't know how to do that. I mean, I don't know the technique. I think I throw the whole darn thing.
Yeah. She just tried it this year for the first time.
Yeah, how hard was it?
It was all right. It's pretty easy once you get the technique.
Okay.
But yeah, you gotta kind of keep it straight.
So you hold both sticks? How do you, I mean, the spear part and the lateral?
Yeah, you kind of balance it on top. Sometimes they lay them on top of their fingers. Sometimes there's a Y in it.
Oh, so there's space between the two?
Just a little bit, yeah. So there's notches started in on this thing.
Oh my goodness.
Starting to look like an arrowhead in.
Oh my goodness. Look at that. So we have some, field stuff, and that's what they're using because it's a little softer breaks.
Yeah.
But that's good. How old are you? 6?
That's awesome. Oh, that's great. You guys ever go out and look for arrowheads?
We have a pony, just ponies of America, POA, and so they have to have a little color. But the color is that Appaloosa, but she's got quarter-horse center, so she's smart, sturdy, and everything else. So we are going to show in October in a Native American regalia class. And so they both have to speak to judge, they have to tell a story, and they have to, wear, the regalia. So they've been working on this, and this is just fabulous that this happened this weekend. That they could both be here and learn about that. Oh, that's gorgeous.
Yeah, shape those.
There you go, give that to your kids.
Oscar.
I only got one right now.
Okay, look, you made that. He's gonna give it to us. What do you say?
Yeah, that can be your example to look at when you're going to try to make one.
Can I have a picture with you? Can you go over there?
Yeah, come over here. Let me put my mask on.
Yeah, man. Keep seeing. Okay, let's show that arrow. Let me see that arrow. Okay, got it. Ready? Oh my God.